Welcome to Turning Pages, a series of in-depth conversations with authors about their works.
All right, well, Pale Gray Dot set 500 years in the future, a fantastic tale. Don Miasek, the author, joins me on the program. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you very much. I'm excited to be here.
So I kind of want to start with your relationship to sci-fi as a genre, and whether you're drawn to the science part of it or the fiction part of it, or do you see a distinction between those two?
So I would say, I started with like Star Trek, which has always kind of tackled both the science aspect when necessary, but also, being willing to set it aside and tell a good story. I would say my connection to science fiction is kind of predicting the future and running hypothetical scenarios on how we're going to deal with the future. So it could come from a science perspective. It could be, hey, we're going to develop AI. How are we going to deal with that? And well, is it going to be like a Terminator situation and we got to worry about killer robots? Or is it going to be like a data situation from Star Trek and they're going to be our friends? From that perspective, from the science aspect, it lets you kind of test these avenues and say, okay, well, we could take the data path, we could take the Terminator path, or we could take the, make a bunch of fake images path. That seems to be the one that we went with. And then outside of science, there's also the social aspect, where it doesn't really matter what the science is. Maybe who cares if it's a warp drive or a hyperdrive or a whatever drive. Just trying to say, okay, well, what would a intergalactic civilization look like? Is it going to be like Foundation? Is it going to be like, Battlestar Galactica? And it kind of lets us as humans run through these hypothetical scenarios in a safe environment.
So it sounds like you were a reader and a watcher of science fiction then, growing up?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. I started with Star Trek, Next Gen and moving on from there. I'm a child of the 80s and 90s. So yeah. And as for reading, absolutely. I try to do both. And even video gaming, right? Well, I'm not going to say video games are modern because they aren't, but anymore. But it's think of like a Mass Effect, for example, which tells a great story. It includes awesome science. It has some social elements. So watcher, reader, and player.
Now, you've been involved in the science fiction realm in Toronto for a while with T.Spec, but this is your debut novel. And I'm curious about, like the moving from like short form or, online to a full novel. And is it a huge leap, or is it something that like you're stacking blocks on top of each other? How do you approach that?
So at least for the the Toronto writers, Toronto science fiction and fantasy writers, and the publishing wing, T.Spec, a lot of that's been like short fiction, but some of it's been novels. I would say for most writers there is some overlap. A lot of people will start with short fiction because it's easier to get it out the door. It's easier to kind of create a little story. You finish it, you can move on. Whereas a novel is possibly a multi-year journey, so you can sort of use a short fiction as a test bed and kind of practice and hone your skills. And I'm not going to say move up to novels because that implies that novels are better, but they are probably they are more complicated to deal with, so it is nice to have that bit of practice.
So does that practice involve like a little bit of problem solving? Like, does it allow you to work out some things before you start shifting towards a novel and having to expand, or is it just the world building in a short form and trying to get to the kernel of something quicker?
Oh yeah, solving problems is such a huge aspect of writing. Maybe it's a plot situation where you've written yourself into a corner. It's like, well, do you go back to chapter 1 and try to fix it? Do you try to write your way out of it? Do you decide, this is completely unworking, you will have to restart it? In writing, there's a whole bunch of styles. None of them are necessarily better, but it is useful to find out what your style is. A classic example is, are you a pantser or are you an architect? Are you familiar with those terms?
Sorry, a dancer or an architect?
Oh, a architect or a pantser. So like, you know, writing by at the seat of your pants.
Oh, okay. I thought like dancing about architecture. I thought you said dancer. So
That
like
would
the
be amazing.
architect part makes sense. Like it's like the world building.
Yeah,
You've thought things out ahead of time, and you're
yeah,
building off a blueprint.
yeah. Whereas a writing by the seat of your pants is more you make it up as you go along, and you say, all right, I want this person to be this, and then oh, wouldn't it be cool if that happens? And that sounds like the way I just described it makes it sound like oh, it's all loosey goosey, and it's not going to turn out great, but it works for a lot of writers, and it's a great opportunity for um to get forward momentum and to get words down on the page. Just to get back to your original question on, short form versus long form, writing short form kind of gives you that opportunity to find out, well, what works better for you. Are you the kind of person that wants to have a plan and then, your entire book is written in basically point form, and then bam, 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 you can punch out the scenes and never deviate from it? Or are you someone that's going to create the character, create the world, and then hey, see what happens, see what the characters do for you, kind of thing. And obviously, you can always be somewhere in between, where you have a plan, and then in the middle of writing it, you decide, you know what, maybe it'd be better if this happened instead of that happened. Then you can go back and always revise the plan.
So what was Pale Gray Dot then? Was it somewhere in between, or was it pants or architecture?
So Pale Gray Dot, what I would say would be somewhere in between. I did have a plan. I did a whole bunch of world building, but plans do change. Like for example, the main three characters, they're essentially supersized. They were exiled for missions gone horribly wrong 50 years ago, and now they're kind of getting back into the game. They're getting embroiled in a conspiracy in the solar system. And the general idea originally was the team that they were part of was like, I imagined it as like, a hockey team that won the Stanley Cup 30 years ago, had some scandal, and now they're kind of back for the alumni game. That was my original vision. That's how I wrote it down in the plan. But as I was actually going through and writing the story, that's where, it didn't feel right that they were just teammates. They needed to be more. They needed to have like a real emotional connection. Why are you gonna move heaven and earth in order to help out, a person that you kind of sort of knew 30 years ago? So it gravitated from a large team to a much smaller team, and the idea that they're much more like siblings than just teammates. So they grew up together. And so that, I had to go back and kind of revise the story and incorporate that aspect, give that closeness, that vibe, instead of just kind of having them be a team.
So is the draft process then like one of problem solving or honing or refining ideas? Like what do you view that as?
Well, it's creating problems and then hopefully solving them. Yeah, no, I mean, you're creating problems along the way and you're hopefully solving them. Um, some writers like to, you know, work out the story to such detail that hopefully all your problems are resolved and you can just write the scenes. And some writers prefer to let the story evolve more organically. Like, yeah, you're writing a story, the character's a little more, I don't know, free spirited. So maybe they won't do the decision that I originally had them doing in the plan. So maybe we'll take this other path, and then we can explore that and kind of see how that goes. And both methods, of course, are completely valid.
For sure.
It's kind of fun.
Now, did you start, like you said, you had this idea of this like hockey team, and 30 years later they're playing in the old timer game. Did you start with the characters, or did you start with attributes that you wanted these characters to have?
Oh, so that's a good question. So I mean, there were certain aspects of the story that I knew I wanted. I wanted to be sci-fi. I wanted to be in a colonized solar system, because I always knew, or I always felt like with science fiction, it can be a little too easy to hand wave certain things. So I'm like, let's try to use real physics. Can we tell a compelling story while doing that? And when it came to the characters, um, I wanted uh, I wanted diversity as far as characters go, and I don't mean that necessarily the way we think of diversity now, although that's important too. I think of it more in the terms of I want their voices to be different. So, for example, one of my characters is Edda. She's a spaceship captain. She's a warship commander. She's, tough and smart and always had a plan and very much believed in, you know, um, doing what's right. So she's a law-abiding person. And then on the other hand, we have Jenna, who is essentially a crazy homeless lady ranting about the government and the chips they put in your head, but she's also fiercely determined and, badass. And the idea that both Edda and Jenna, they had the exact same calamity hit them. They were both fired from the same team 50 years ago, but because of their differing personalities, they reacted completely different. One of them bounced back, no problem, lateral move from the spy agency to, the military, and the other person didn't bounce back. She spiraled down and out of control. And then the third character, Tierney, was essentially somewhere in between, where I wanted someone who was just kind of eking out a living, thinking like a, past glory person who never really fully recovered from greatness and still kind of always wanted back in the game, but never really, got their life back together. So I wanted that variety of characters.
Yeah, it seems like Tierney has like ambivalence and uncertainty in a space where both Ezra and Jenna have fixed certainty, but on opposite or like, necessarily like differential views.
Yes, and that's exactly what I was going for. Tierney is meant to be the guy like, well, you don't necessarily know who you're going to side with, where the others, you more or less know where they stand.
Is that to help kind of the plot mechanics that he's there waffling on things, or is that to explore kind of like ambiguity in the face of, overarching government control and like this colonizing aspect of the world that like a lot of people maybe exist in the Tierney space? Yeah,
so his waffling is important because it shows both sides. He's the guy that can say, well, the government does have a point. They need to make laws and they need to, um, take these steps. But then on the other hand, trampling on people's rights, well, that's obviously horrible. So he's the guy that can sort of see both sides of it, whereas Jenna and Ezra can't. It's also important from a dramatic standpoint because you don't know who you're going to side with. And so that hopefully keeps the reader going, like, oh, well, what's he going to choose? Whereas with Jenna and Ezra, you more or less knew how they're going to handle a situation. So for both dramatic reasons and exploring the world.
You'd mentioned obviously that this is something that they're responding to something that happened 50 years ago. I'm curious about the timeline choices that are made in this book. One, that it's set 500 years in the future, but two, that like life seems to have been extended, but I can't determine like how mature people are like physically versus like emotionally with that extension. Like, because in some ways, like they don't seem like senior citizens.
Yep.
And where did that come from, and like what problems did that maybe present, or what opportunities did it provide?
Yeah, so I mean that's a great question. So the idea is, yeah, you're right. That's happened 50 years ago, but these aren't 80-year-olds rolling around trying to get back into the game. This isn't like the Expendables. And part of that was because I wanted to explore the idea of stagnation in society. Because I sort of feel like, at least in today's society, society progresses because our children take over. One generation dies, their views are gone because they are deceased. Their children's views are now going to come over. So in that way, we are able to both literally evolve and evolve as a society. Well, in the Pale Gray verse, that doesn't happen. The people do not die of old age. They may die of other causes, but more or less, the old ways are always going to stay there, never going to change. So that was one thing I wanted to explore. And another reason for it is purely from a pragmatic future-proofing aspect, in the sense of if I ever decide, hey, I'd like to write a story that takes place, 800 years in the future, I still have the opportunity to use those characters if I desire. So that's just purely from a pragmatic convenience stake.
Gotcha. So when you are kind of gaming that out or figuring out like the architecture of this, like, are you trying to identify those kinds of problems ahead of time so that it's like, oh, I do leave myself this avenue, I leave this out, or provide myself these opportunities, and I'm not writing myself into some sort of corner from the purported science of it?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. There is the risk. I mean, you are constantly trying to leave yourself out and ways to deal with problems. Like at least for me, when I was writing, I have like a spreadsheet that lists the exact timelines. Um, both from a macro standpoint. So if someone says, "Oh, my grandmother is 400 years old," you better believe there's a entry in that spreadsheet that says 400 years ago, this person's grandma was born. So that way I don't make any hilarious mistakes where it's like, well, that person's grandma was born in, 1875, and now, whoops, that's presumably unrealistic. And then there's also the matter of consistency, so that, the as a Jenna and Cherney are more or less the same age, well, make sure that's all consistent, make sure I don't mess up somebody's career path. So if they say that they served on this ship from this year to that year, make sure I haven't gotten something wrong. It's like, wait a minute, they weren't in that job. So part of it is that, but it's also even just from like a micro standpoint, in the sense that the book itself, I've gone through and done the timeline, the spreadsheet to make sure that if someone said, this going from Earth to Mars, well, that's going to take 2 weeks. I have the calculations that say this is how long they're going to accelerate for, this is how long they're going to be coasting for, this is how long they're going to be decelerating for. Now, is that important to the book? In a lot of ways, no, because who cares what number goes into the kilometer per hour aspect? But it does make sure I don't make any mistakes as far as like the feeling of something. So I'm not accidentally implying that, trips from one planet to another are a matter of going to the corner store, and then later just implying that it's, a months long grueling exercise. So it keeps me focused and consistent, even if the exact detail might not actually matter. But as far in, just to go back to your original question, when you mentioned like, making sure I always have outs and stuff like that. When I did draft one, I would just put in placeholder figures. Someone would say, "Oh, it'll take 2 weeks." And I'll put like a little mark that said, verify that later. And the idea being that I don't get bogged down with doing calculations in the middle of writing draft one. All that stuff can be done later. So it's kind of a back and forth on making sure you don't write yourself into problem, but also making sure you can be consistent in the future.
And it sounds like maybe not disrupting your own like writing flow by doing, pulling out the calculator.
Yeah, writers get distracted easy enough. We don't need more.
It's interesting you were talking about, kind of like the, trip to Mars taking 2 weeks, like the calculations on that. It does provide you with a very interesting sequence, partway through the book where there's like a space, like to me it read like a submarine fight in a classic sub film that like, they're trying to, make calculations and avoid, missile strikes, and that there's like, gravity, like, not obviously it's in space, but the gravity of the situation in terms of like how they're maneuvering and the like scientific reality of it. Like I have to imagine that was part of what you were weighing when you were figuring out some of these things.
Yes, and that kind of goes back to when I was saying I wanted to not break the laws of physics. I love Star Wars and I love Star Trek, but warfare in space is not going to be, the World War II in space or the Cold War in space. Presumably going to look completely different. And so I wanted to show one possible avenue. And it may just be a matter of who can throw more firepower at the enemy and who can calculate the odds better than somebody else. So it's not necessarily just a matter of who can, aim your space laser better. It may be who had the better mathematicians and add some gravity and weight to the experience. And that means there may be situations where both sides run the calculations, they do the numbers, and they realize, nope, this person's going to win. All right, no point fighting. You win. we lose, we're going to leave kind of thing. So that was me trying to avoid doing the standard space fight.
You have, I made the submarine comp there, but like you have a couple of agencies. You have the United Fleet, and then this Earth Security Service. And I'm curious if like you were thinking of any kind of real world or existing comps for these two organizations, these competing bodies. Like it felt like some maybe like CIA versus FBI, or like CIA versus like the U.S. Navy or something. Like they're
Yeah, so I would love the political infighting of agencies that in theory are on the same side, but because the agency's job is not to serve the larger, state, it's to serve themselves and make sure they survive. Sometimes there is inter-service rivalry. As far as real world analogies go, yeah, I was thinking either CIA for the Earth Security Service or maybe even the KGB, because they're supposed to be, a little sinister, right? Um, if somebody tells you they work for the CIA, you're probably not going to panic because that's, it's a job. But if somebody works for the KGB, oh, no, oh my goodness, maybe you sit up a little straighter and, you know, say some nice things about the government. So that's kind of what I was aiming for them. Where the United Fleet, yeah, would be more or less the Navy, or a traditional military.
now obviously like your three central characters all had played a role in the ESS, and then one of them as it transitions to the United Fleet, one goes underground and one kind of stops working altogether. Did that allow you to explore kind of how people react to like kind of being part of a group in the know and then being on the outside of that information? Like, was that part of what you were wrestling with this book?
Yeah, so one of my that's really good insight. One of my original, you can almost call it an elevator pitch, was what if James Bond got fired and had to pump gas for a living? He used to be, and obviously I'm thinking specifically of Cherney here. He used to be the coolest dude around. He was a spy. He had all the best gadgets. He lived like a king. People looked up to him. It was just an awesome life. He got to be exciting. And then you got fired, and now you're just a nobody. Now you're um, on a tarmac running scans on a space freighter, and nobody cares who you are, and your boss is yelling at you, and you can't get enough hours. And I wanted to see, okay, well, what would that do to somebody? And so that was what I was trying to explore there. That was a lot of fun to write, I can tell you.
Was he your favorite character to write as a result of that, or do you have a favorite?
Oh, okay, so I get the question a lot. And to be clear, I love all my characters, but I do love Jenna most of all. Like you said, Cherney is great because he can kind of play both sides. But I do love Jenna just because she is, first of all, very easy to write. She'll just blurt out whatever she is thinking, which is a lot of fun. And she's always in the most fun environments. She's the person that's going to be slinking around in the slums and the ramshackle tent cities. And now she's in a hotel with like mold growing in the wall. Oh my goodness, I could describe that all day long. Whereas, at least in the case of Edda, she's on a warship, which is generally fairly clean, fairly organized, so it's not as exciting to write as far as compared to Jenna. So I love them all, but yeah, I love Jenna most of all.
It's interesting you say that because, of course, as his quarters, you remark upon them being like Spartan and like she has no personal effects and stuff. And meanwhile, Jenna, you talk about her implants being grimy and she's self-soldered them and stuff, and that like it maybe hints at the fact that like you're living kind of vicariously through her. Plus, I guess she's an agent of action, right? Like she's the one making things happen, whereas as someone who's got someone above her in command is a reactive person.
Yeah, absolutely. Jenna does not like to take orders, whereas Edda generally fine with it. She takes orders, she gives orders, everything is nice and orderly. And that's me trying to portray two different people that have faced the same dilemma, the same catastrophe, and reacting very differently.
speaking of orders, I want to maybe close the last thing is on the person they all used to work for in the ESS, who is mostly referred to as her, and this notion of this pull, that they've all come from a position where they're all always trying to appease her and under her thumb and under her observation. And how much thought did you give to how you would kind of portray and withhold information about the her of ESS?
That was really, really difficult. I can tell you, that was where, beta readers were very helpful, because you're right. I'm always trying to tease out information. I don't want to give spoilers, but throughout the book, you get little tidbits about what she is about and what her deal is. And sometimes it's even a little bit contradictory. And is that just somebody's opinion of her? Is that is it fact? If one person says, she loves all her agents and they believe it wholeheartedly, and another person comes and says, no, she doesn't. She just treats them like pawns, moving them on a chessboard. Who is right? Well, you could kind of go either way. And it was a really difficult balance to achieve, as far as giving enough information to keep the reader interested and grounded, like they're not lost, but also keeping them wanting to read more in order to find out more. Even not giving her a name and only describing her through the pronoun, that was kind of I didn't know if that would work. I was like, there's a very good chance some editor is going to look at me and say, no, you come on, give a name, Don. But thankfully, it worked out. Again, that's where writing groups were very handy, and beta readers were very handy. They could kind of point out where they got confused, which parts they liked, which part they didn't. And I'm glad it worked out. It's something I'm very proud of.
Well, it certainly makes it more ominous. And I mean, you describe this notion of this pull that she has on them. And I think if you'd been naming her all along rather than making it this like veil, I don't know if that pull would have worked as well.
Yeah, the pull was a lot of fun because, again, there's this mental compulsion they have to serve her. And there's always the question of how much of that is just pure, straight up brainwashing. You will serve her because you have no choice. Like there's a chip in your brain that tells you to do it. And how much of it is more than brainwashing? You truly do love her. She protected you when you were a child. She raised you. She made you the badass super spy you are now. So even without the compulsion, you'll still follow her. So I had a lot of fun exploring that area.
Well, the book itself is a lot of fun. Pale Grey Dot, out through Ravenstone Press. Don, thanks very much for taking some time to join me on the program.
So much. Thank you so much, Michael. It was a lot of fun.